All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let us begin. So we are picking up today's daf is Pei Aleph, and we're 81, and we are picking up at the Mishnah on Pei Aleph. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the month of Sivan, Justin and Abigail Rosemore, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Droshos this month in memory of their beloved son Kobe, Yaakov David Ben Yosef Tzadok, our monthly sponsor, Alan and Sue Marowitz and family, Jason, Deborah, Justin, Rebecca, Mindy, and Simcha, and all of the grandchildren. Emerita V'Rafur Shlema for Su Shulamis Tova Bas Mindel. We thank our DAF sponsor, Jason Lalonde, in memory of his father-in-law, Sender Beneficial, and for speedy recovery for his mother-in-law, Chaya Chana Risha Bas Esther Zanna, and Saeed and Sima Haken for dedicating the daf today in honor of Barry and Judy Nabazni, for hosting our backyard minyan, and Shimi Nabazni for davening and laning for us. Beautiful. Also, we thank all of our sponsors very much for their incredible generosity. And with that, let us begin. So top of Pei Aleph, brand new Mishnah. Says the Mishnah. Etzem. So we'll say, remember again, still continuing really in the same theme, of how much of a particular item must one carry in order to be chayiv. So remember again, the answer to that is always the same, which is that halacha l'maisa, you have to carry a unit of chashivos. You have to carry an amount that is considered to be chashiv in order to be chayiv for otzah. Of course, the variable is the amount that is considered to be chashiv for one item will not be the same amount that is chashiv for a different item. So says the Mishnah, Etzem kedei lasos tarvat. So if you carry out the bone, so a bone, you're chayiv if you carry out enough bone to go ahead and make a spoon. Rabbi Huda Omer kedei lasos menuchaf. Rabbi Huda says enough bone in order to make out of it a lock. A lock. We'll see exactly what that means in the Gemara. Zechuchis, glass, kedei ligror bo rosh hakarkar, in order to go ahead and scrape the top of the pick. The pick that the Talmud says was a pick that was used in a loom to separate out the warp and the weft threads. Tsuror o even, a stone or a pebble, kedei lizrok ba'of, has to be large enough to throw at a bird in order to scare it away. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer kedei lizrok bebehema, large enough ultimately again to throw at an animal in order to go ahead and scare it away. Fine. Says the Gemara Lememra, Dishur Rabbi Huda Nafish. So we'll say again, we're assuming over here that when Rabbi Huda argues on the Tanakama, right? So the Mishnah begins with a discussion about how large of a bone must one carry in order to go ahead and be chayav for otzah on Shabbos. So the Tanakama says tarvod, enough to make a spoon, and Rabbi Huda says enough to make a lock. So the assumption is that Rabbi Huda's shear is larger than the Tanakama. So the Gemara says, how kaima alon the shear d'Rabbanan nafish? But in general, again, with the machlokes Rabbi Huda and the Rabbanan, we assume that the Rabbanan have the larger shear. To which the Gemara says, Amra ula chafi posachas. You're right. When Rabbi Huda said enough bone to make a lock, he didn't actually mean the lock in its entirety. Rather, what did he mean? The teeth of the lock. So in fact, Rabbi Huda's shear is smaller, and when he says enough bone to make a lock, he meant the teeth of the lock. Good. Beautiful. Says the Gemara. Tan Rabbanan. Chafi posachas tahorin. Well, so now that the Gemara just mentioned the teeth of the lock, ultimately, again, the Gemara quotes another halacha, that when it comes to the teeth of the lock, they themselves, before they are embedded in the lock, tahorin, are ritually pure. Now we'll say, now the reason they're tar, if you look at Rashi, chapi posachas tahorin, techol zman shelo chibron ba einon ru'uyin luklum. Because we'll say, remember again, in order to be makabel tumah, an item has the designation of a kli, or of some type of purposeful unit. The teeth of a lock, before they are embedded in the lock, are purposeless and useless. As such, they are not makabel tumah. So chapi posachas tahorin, kaven biposachos, but once you embed them, right, once you affix them to the lock, then halacha l'maisa they are tmein, they're tumah, which makes sense. Because we'll say that at that point in time, they're part of a kli. Once they're part of a kli, they will be makabel tumah. Vishelgal, but ultimately, again, if you go ahead and you put them in a gal, now we'll say Rashi points out over here, look at Rashi, Vishelgal, v'yapalsachas hazos eno shel kelim, kigon shel shido migdal ela shelgal. But if the lock that we're talking about is the lock, for example, in doors of a fence. So, for example, I will say, up until now, we assume what's a lock? Like a lock is a movable item that you put on a chest or on a box. What happens again if the lock in question is, let's say, again on the gates of the chutzner, right? You have a chutzner and you have a gate, and you go ahead and you put the lock in that gate. Then what's the halacha? Even if you establish that lock and you attach it to the door, or you attach it with nails, it is going to be tahar. Why? Because we both say again, anything that is attached to the ground has the status of ground, right? And the halacha is that earth itself cannot be mekabel tuma. So therefore, I will say, if just an interesting aside. So a lock, once the teeth are embedded in the lock, then halacha l'maaseh they become part of the kli. Once they become part of the kli, the utensil, then they are mekabel tuma. If, however, you are embedding the teeth of a lock in a lock that is a doorway, let's say to a chutzner, so again, this door is attached to the ground. Anything that is attached to the ground is not mekabel tuma. Okay, just an aside. Says the Gemara, Zuchuch is kidei lagar. So remember again, if you have glass, so if you carry enough glass to go ahead and literally scrape the pick of the loom, so says the Gemara Tana, Zuchuch is kidei liftzoa ba shnei nimin ka'achas. So we'll say a different shear. Again, it's all the same shear, just a different explanation of the shear. Enough glass to go ahead and cut 2 threads at once. Okay, tsurar o even kedei lizrok ba'of. If you go ahead and you throw a pebble or a stone, and it has to be large enough to scare away a bird. Rabbi Elazar Omer and Rabbi Elazar says enough to go ahead and scare away an animal. Says the Gemara, Amrab Yaakov, Amrab Yochanan, V'hu shemar gesh esbo. The idea over here is that the stone must be large enough that when you throw it at the animal, that the animal is able to feel it. Right? That's the chap over here. That the animal ultimately, again, should be able to feel it. V'kama shiuro, and how large is such a stone? So the Gemara says, Tanya, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, Mishkal Asara Zuz. It is a stone that has the weight of 10 zuz. Okay? So the Gemara says as follows. Zunin, or Zonin, all lebei midrash. So we'll say the sage Zonin went into the base medrash. Amalahu, Rabosai, Avonim shel beis hakis, shiurin bekama. So we'll see, that's an interesting question. Halacha l'maisa, what is the shear for stones of an outhouse? So let's remember again, they used to wipe themselves with stones. So what Zonin was asking was, what is the shear for the stones of the bathroom, of the Beis HaKisin? Now look at Rashi. Shi'ur bekama l'schayev aleh. So we'll say, so remember, up until now, when we were talking about stones, we assumed that the size of a stone that you would be chayiv for Hotzah on Shabbos, was either a stone that was large enough to throw and scare away a bird, or throw and scare away an animal, that an animal should feel it. Zonin is coming and asking about a different kind of stone. What about stones that are used for wiping oneself after one defecates? So halacha l'maisa again, look at Rashi, shirin bekama, l'schayiv alei. So we'll say, so how many or what size of those stones would you be chayiv for Hotzah on Shabbos? Inami, l'taltalon b'chatzor lachlizon l'beis hakisei, v'idi chatshurhu, to be midi d'chazon l'chayim. And we'll say now, as we're going to see something very interesting. Now remember, stones by themselves are muktzah. The pashto stones are muktzah. We're going to see that there was a dispensation by the rabbi. Remember, muktzah is rabbinic. The rabbis lifted the muktzah restrictions on what we'll call bathroom stones, which makes sense because lemaisa, again, bathroom stones are needed to clean oneself after leaving oneself. So the rabbis lifted the restrictions on that. What the Gemara is asking essentially is a twofold question. Number one, halacha lemaisa. So how many stones, quote unquote, fall under the license of bathroom stones? So if I want to carry stones for my use in the bathroom, how much can I carry? And I will say the corollary to that is, how many stones of bathroom stones do I have to carry out on Shabbos in order to be chayiv for hotzah, right? It's the same shaila. Because remember, again, whatever amount of stones I need to use in the bathroom, that's the amount the dispensation is going to cover. But that also represents the unit of chashivas, the unit of importance. And if I carry that amount out on Shabbos, I will be chayiv. So says the Gemara. So shirin bekama amrlo kezayis keegos ukebetza. It's 3 stones, one the size of an olive, one the size of a nut, and one the size of an egg. So So this is actually very interesting. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says kezayis kegos ukebetza shalosh machnisan lekinuach. So we'll say, so the way people used to wipe themselves, and again, also, I want to point out, like, this is not this is not like chachmas chazal over here, right? This is how people clean themselves after using the bathroom. So this was societally what was done. So you would take 3 stones with you into the bathroom, one the size of an olive, one the size of a nut, one the size of an egg. What's the pshat? Rashi says shlosh machnisan lekinuach u'mekaneach zachar zeh. And both say they would be used in this particular order. So the Gemara says, Zu achar zu, achas kezais v'achas ke'egos v'achas ke'beitza, betchilas mekaneach pi harei biktana, lahasir rei hanidbak sham, shagdola pochasas u'melach lisivosas. Both say what you would do is you would use these stones in order from smallest to largest, in order that one would be able to wipe oneself effectively. So ultimately, again, you would begin with the small stone, the olive-sized stone, then the nut-sized stone, and then the egg-sized stone. That was logic. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, 3 stones, that's what you were permitted to move for Shabbos, al tzilchutz muktzah. And again, in the event that you were to go ahead and carry these stones out on Shabbos, you would be chayev for hotzah. Says the Gemara, Amar lahu, v'chi tardani yachnis. So they said ultimately again, he said to them, is a person bringing a scale into the bathroom? I was also, what I mean, this is pretty precise over here, right? The size of an olive, the size of a nut, the size of an egg. So again, a person is sitting there measuring out stones on Shabbos. So says the Gemara, Nimnu v'gamru, rather what they said is you're right. Kim mali hayad. The idea is you also say that for bathroom use, a person would use a handful of stones. That's what was done, a handful of stones. So if you think about it, we'll say if you have 3 stones, one the size of an olive, one the size of a nut, and one the size of an egg, so pretty much again, that's a handful of stones. So a person would use, so therefore again, you would be permitted to move a handful of stones on Shabbos for use in the bathroom. And halacha l'maisa for hotzah purposes, if you were to carry out a handful of stones, you would be chayiv for that. Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer, Kezayis Ke'egos Ukebetza. Rabbi Yossi echoes this shear of 3 stones, one the size of an olive or nut and an egg. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Mishum Aviv Melo Hayad. So we'll say, in reality, it's the same shear, right? Just to point out, they're not really arguing. They're just really discussing how to best frame the halacha. The problem with the statement of 3 stones, the size of Kezayis Ke'egos in Kebetza, the problem with that is that's very specific. Masha'in came a handful is a bit more understandable and achievable just in a normative situation. Okay, but I will say, but interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara is saying that's the amount of stones you'd be permitted to move, and that's the amount of stones that ultimately one would be chayiv for hotzah for on Shabbos. Tarabanan. B'shkimo avanim markuzulos mutu lahachnis lebeis hakisei. So we'll say again, the Gemara says, Bryce says, 3 sharpened stones are what you are permitted to go ahead and take in with you to the bathroom. When we say sharpened stones, I will say the idea was obviously to remove the excrement. So the idea over here was that the stones would be a bit sharpened on the end to be able to clean oneself. So you're permitted to go ahead and bring in 3 sharpened stones into the bathroom. And I will say, what is the shear of those stones? Rabbi Meir Omer Ke'egos, Rabbi Huda Omer Ke'beitza, Amar Rafram Bar Papa Amar Rav Chisda Kimachlokis Kan Kach Machlokis. So again, so over here different prices and different opinions. So Rabbi Meir says the size of the stone is like a nut, or the stones is like a nut. Rabbi Huda says the size of a stones is like an egg. Rafram Bar Papa says the same way there's a machlokis here, there's also a machlokis by esrog. So I'll say interesting about what is the minimum shear, the smallest amount, right, that is usable ultimately for an esrog. So the Gemara says, Kabbalah says, Hassam Masnis in Hacha Braisa. To which one says, 1 second. I will say, here, this is a Braisa. By Esrog, the Machlokis is in the Mishnah. Rather than the way you have to say this, Ela ki Machlokis be Esrog, Kach Machlokis kan. What you have to say is the same way that there is a Machlokis regarding minimum size, minimum shear, by Esrog, which is a Mishnah, so too there's a Machlokis, ultimately again by minimum size, for the stones used in the bathroom on Shabbos. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Avaloes a payis, but on Shabbos you cannot use a payis. Says the Gemara, my payis, what does that mean? Rabbi Zera Karshini Bavlaisa. So we'll say, he says, Kashini Bavlaisa, Rashi says over here, Hachi Mikro Mishum Shebaval Eretz Lachihi, V'amacharisha Ma'ala Regalim. So we'll say, literally, Babylonian pebbles. Babylonian pebbles. So we'll say, you can't use Babylonian pebbles to wipe on Shabbos. Now, the idea over here, we'll say, is very simple, because the earth crumbles. Because the earth crumbles, and therefore, again, you're going to end up carrying something that is not really helpful ultimately for what it is that you need to accomplish. So therefore, halacha l'maisi, you can't use pais, excuse me. Amarava, asr l'mashmish b'tzurar b'shabbos, keder shemamashmish b'chol. So also another interesting halacha. Rava says, you can't go ahead and literally utilize a stone on Shabbos the same way that you utilize it during the week. Now, what is this referring to? Look at Rashi. L'mashmish, hanitzrach lipanos ve'inu yachal lipanos, Amrina lekama b'pirkin, tememashmish bitzror b'nekev v'hu niftach. So we'll say, this is interesting. So the Gemara says, apparently, if a person is having problems defecating, what you would do is you would manipulate the rectal area with the stone, I guess, to open things up a little bit, to be able to go ahead and relieve oneself. So the Gemara says, you can't do this on Shabbos. You can't do this on Shabbos. So Rashi says, so again, fine. So the Gemara says, Rava says, you can't do on Shabbos what you would normally do during the week. So the Gemara says, Maskif Lamar. Now, again, I will say we don't know why that is yet, but the Gemara is making that statement. Maskif Lamar Zutra listakin. Adon Lamar Zutra says, I will say, then a person's putting himself in danger. We'll say in general, Chazal held this belief, which again, of course, we know to be true, which is if a person can't relieve themselves in a normal way, that poses health problems. So halacha l'maisa, again, if a person can't go ahead and engage in this manipulation on Shabbos, doesn't that put a person in some type of physical danger? To which the Gemara says, Kila acher yad. What it means is that halacha l'maisa, you should do it with a shinu. In other words, I will say that you shouldn't do this on Shabbos the same way you do this during the week. Now, look at Rashi. Kila achar yad. It's the first of the intermediate wide lines in Rashi. Hai kiderach tekama rava kiderach hamamashmish bechol below shinui mishum hasharas nimin. Aval kila achar yad ki gon oches sorbebeis. That's supposed to Shabbos. So it says we're going to see the concern about engaging in this type of manipulation on Shabbos was a concern about removing hairs. Right? Because there may be some hairs in this part of the body, and the concern is, again, under normal circumstances, if manipulation is occurring, one could pull out hairs. Pulling out hairs on Shabbos also is a problem of gozes, a problem of shearing. So halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, we don't want you doing this the normal way you do it during the week, out of the concern that you may come to remove hairs. So what you can do is, you can do it with a shinui. So if you do it in some type of quote-unquote, more abnormal way, avoid the removal of hairs, then halacha l'maisa, this would be permitted. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yanai, im yesh makom kavua lebeis hakisei, melo hayad, im lav behechreya. So Rabbi Yanai says, if a person has a set place for their beis hakis, in other words, the bathroom is in an established place, then halacha l'maisa, you could bring in a handful of stones to the bathroom. Because what's the logic? The logic is whatever you don't use now, you will use later. Since this is a beis hakisei kavua, this is an established bathroom. So again, you can leave the stones there, and ultimately, again, like I said, what you don't use now, you'll use later. But however, if you're leaving yourself in a place that is not a beis hakisei kavua, not an established bathroom, then be'echreya. Be'echira, Rashi says, like the middle shear. What was the middle shear? Remember, again, for the stones of the bathroom, we had 3 different shiurim, right? Kizayis, ke'egos, kebeitza. So the Gemara says, if you are utilizing a temporary bathroom, then halacha l'maisa, all you're allowed to do is to bring in the middle shear, right? The middle shear of stones, which is the size of the nut, right? The size of the nut. So the Gemara says as follows: Meducha kitana shal b'samim. It's supposed to be an interesting case. What about a meducha kitana? We'll say now meducha kitana shal b'samim is a small mortar, right? A small mortar, or a small mill, right? A small mortar. Rashi says meducha kitana melachta le'iser asla talt. So we'll say, so again, under normal circumstances, so a mortar is muktzah, right? A mortar is muktzah. Why is a mortar muktzah? Very simple, because a mortar is used for grinding. Grinding is schika, right? Schika samanim, or tochen, grinding, and halacha l'maisa, again, that's asur on Shabbos. So therefore, again, under normal circumstances, a mortar is going to be muktzah. So the Gemara says, Meducha kitana shal b'samim. Say if you have a small mortar that's used to grind up herbs, that's muktzah on Shabbos. Amar Rav Sheshes, im yesh aleha eid mutter. Then Abbas, this is very interesting. So what happens again if halacha l'maisa, you want to use it now as one of the wiping stones. Right? So a person uses the bathroom, they want to use the small mortar, right? They want to use the small mortar ultimately again to wipe themselves. So the Gemara says, if there's testimony on it, then you could go ahead and use it. What does that mean? In Yeshala, Eid Rashi says, Kinua chameyed shasuy lakach mutlo tag lekina. So we'll say if there are traces that this stone has already been used for wiping purposes, then halacha l'maisa you could move it on Shabbos. So both say, just to understand what's happening over here. So a mortar by itself is muktzah, right? Because at the end of the day, grinding is asur on Shabbos. Interestingly enough, even though stones are normally muktzah, you can move stones for wiping purposes on Shabbos. So what about if you want to use the mortar stone as a wiping stone? So halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, if it's already been used. What does it mean it's already been used? Meaning if there are traces on it that it's already been used, then halacha l'maisa you can move it on Shabbos. The Gemara says, Meisvei, 1 second. Asar devarim mevi'in esad l'nidei tachtonios. There are 10 things, the Gemara says, that cause hemorrhoids. Ve'eluheim, these are they. Ha'ochel alekanim, one who goes ahead and eats the leaves of reeds. Va'ale gifanim, the leaves of a vine. Ve'lulave gifanim, ultimately again palm leaves. So the Gemara says, Umarige behema below melach, or the ridged parts of animals, right? If you eat the ridged part of flesh that was not properly salted, v'shidro shaldag, the spine of a fish, v'dag maliach shel bishal kol tzarcho, or salted fish that was not fully cooked, v'ashosa shmari yayin, or one who goes ahead and drinks dregs of wine, v'hamakaniach b'sid ubecharasis, one who goes in and wipes himself with a piece of lime or with a piece of clay, like a piece of earthenware, or b'tzrar shekiniach bochabero, or if you use the stone that someone else used. The most major no-no to use the stone that someone else used. V'yesh omrim afa tolazo beisakise. Others say even if a person holds himself back from leaving himself in the bathroom. So all these things cause hemorrhoids. So we'll say, so therefore, what the Gemara is asking here is as follows. You're telling me that under normal circumstances, a mortar is muktzah, which of course makes perfect sense, because at the end of the day, it's used for a perpetrated activity of crushing. Good. Totally understand that. What happened now? The Gemara says, but if you find traces of excrement on it, which indicates that it's been used already, then halacha l'maisa, you could move it, you could use it on Shabbos. So I'll say the Gemara is assuming that if you're finding traces of excrement, that's because someone else used it. So the Gemara is saying, you're telling me then that I could use the stone that someone else used? We just said before, the Brisa just says explicitly that halacha l'maisa, using the stone that was used by someone else could cause hemorrhoids. So why would the Gemara go ahead and suggest such a thing like this? To which the Gemara says, Lokashya, habala habiyavish. The only time using a stone that someone else used is problematic is when the waste is fresh, is still moist. But if the waste already dried, then halacha l'maisa is not a problem. The other possibility is it's only problematic to use a stone used by someone else when the waste is on both sides of the stone. But if it's only on one side of the stone, it's not problematic. What's the other possibility is, there's no problem with reusing a stone when it's you who used it. The problem, of course, is when someone else used it and now you want to use it after them. So the Gemara says, by the Rav Yosef, Yardu ala gishamim v'nishtashtashu. So ultimately, again, if it rained, v'nishtashtashu. So we'll say ultimately again. And now what happens? Rashi says v'nishtashtashu also aid. So we'll say, so again, this is going back to the case of the mortar. So let's say again, so now plain mortar muktzah Shabbos. If it's clear, right, that the mortar was used as a wiping stone, then halacha l'maisa, it's not muktzah on Shabbos. What happens if it rained? What happens if it rained and as a result, it wiped away any traces of waste from the stone? So the Gemara says, Amr Mahu, Amrlei, Im Hayarishuman Nikar Mutter. If halacha l'maisa, the rishum literally means like the image or the stain, right, is still recognizable there, then halacha l'maisa, you can move it on Shabbos. The idea being, meaning, even if there's no actual waste on it, But if there's some type of recognizable display that there was waste on it, then ultimately, again, that gives it the designation of a wiping stone, and halacha l'maisa can be moved on Shabbos. Rashi says over here, "Iri shumo nikar motor techeva dema'is lo chazid b'samim v'lo mevatla meves hakisi." So just to understand, the idea is that any time that there's some recognizable outline or trace of waste on that mortar, a person's not going to use it to grind up bisamim. That's the logic, and therefore halacha l'maisa, it's not muktzah, but rather again it will be usable as a wiping stone. Fine. Rabba Barav Shila Mirav. So what's Rabba Shila asked the Shaila Rav? I'm Rav Chisda, excuse me. So we'll say this was the Shaila asked Rav Chisda. Mahula losam acharav lagad. What's an interesting Shaila? If a person is going up to the rooftop to go ahead and relieve himself, can he carry his wiping stones up to the roof or not? Rashi says, Mahula losam acharav lagag. Im Allah sham lipanos michashim latircha yisirasa olo. So we'll say halacha l'maisa. Is it excess exertion to carry the wiping stones up to the roof or not? Amrle gadol kavod abrias shedoches lo saseh shevateras. We'll say this is actually the statement that is driving everything. Kavod abrias, human dignity, is so incredibly important that it even sets aside biblical prohibitions. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. What does this mean? Shedoches lo saseh d'chsiv v'salamta mehem prat lezakin ve'eno lefi kvodo. So we'll say, interestingly enough, there's a halacha of hashavas haveda, which means if you go ahead and you see a lost object, then halacha l'maisa, again, you're obligated to return it to its owner. Not only that, but halacha l'maisa, again, if you see a lost object, you are not permitted to make yourself as if you didn't see it. There's a law to turn away from it. What happens if someone finds something and ultimately, again, it's eno lefi kavodo? It's not appropriate for him to go ahead and return this item, right? The Gadol Hadar finds a sack, right? And it's not bakavadik for the Gadol Hadar to pick up a sack and to try to find its owner. So the halacha is you're permitted to turn away from that. In that kind of situation where hashavas haveda compromises your dignity, you're not obligated to return the lost object. The Gemara highlights this as a general principle, that in general, when it comes to the preservation of human dignity, the preservation of human dignity is so important that it even has the ability to set aside a biblical prohibition. So the Gemara is suggesting over here is as follows. The need to properly wipe oneself after defecating is incredibly important, an absolute necessity for human dignity. So because of that, one would in fact be permitted to go ahead and carry the stones up to the roof, even though again carrying it up to the roof may be an additional exertion. But halacha l'maisa, because that exertion is for the preservation of human dignity, therefore it is permitted. Yosef Mereimar v'kamer lahash ma'isa. So also Mereimar was sitting, and he was telling over this particular ruling. Eis ve'Ravina l'Mereimar. So Ravina raised the kasha to Mereimar. Rabbi Eliezer Omer notal adam kisei mishalafanav lachtos boshinov. So it's an interesting discussion. Rabbi Eliezer says that halacha l'maisa, if there is wood in front of me, there are wood chips in front of me, I could take a wood chip or a splinter and use it as a toothpick in order to pull out, in order to pluck out, in order to remove the meat or the food that's between my teeth. So also if you look at Rashi says very mishalafanov, kismin hamutalan agave karka. If there are wood chips on the ground, so the Gemara says v'lamrin al muktzin. So that's very interesting. But Rabbi Eliezer says that literally, if I see a splinter of wood on the ground, I can pick it up, use it to remove the food in between my teeth as a toothpick. The Gemara says, even though I both say under normal circumstances, I would say that what? That halacha l'maisa, a splinter on the ground is going to be muktzah. It's going to be muktzah. Nevertheless, again, to remove the food between my teeth is considered to be kavod abrias, is considered to be human dignity, and therefore halacha l'maisa, I am permitted to go ahead and pick it up. So the Chacham say, lo yital ela min ha'avush shabehema. The Chacham, on the other hand, say that no, halacha l'maisa, you could only take it if it's from, we'll say, avos literally means like the cradle or the trough of an animal. The only time I could go ahead and take a splinter, right, as a toothpick is if that wood was actively set aside for use for an animal. So we'll say at least if it's set aside for use as an animal, halacha l'maisa, again, it was not set aside for non-use. So we'll say, so an interesting machlokes over here. can I go ahead and take a splinter, right, that's on the ground, and use it as a toothpick to remove food that's in my teeth? So remember again, under normal circumstances, we say a splinter or a toothpick or a piece of wood on the ground on Shabbos is muktzah. Rabbi Eliezer says that what? You could still pick it up and use it to remove to remove the food from your teeth. The Chachamim say no. It has to be somewhat prepared for use. Now it doesn't have to be prepared for human use. It can be prepared for animal use, but it must be prepared in some way. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. Hachi hashta hasam. So we'll say so again. So the shaila is, isn't that covered abrios? Now we'll say now the assumption is the reason I'm using a toothpick is to go ahead and remove the food from my teeth because that's covered abrias. That's what looks nice, right? That's what looks nice. So I don't understand why do the Chachamim hold that halacha lemaisa the toothpick has to be prepared for use, at least in some capacity, for an animal? Why don't they agree with Rabbi Eliezer that halacha lemaisa I could just pick it off the ground? To which there is a very simple distinction. Hashta hasam adam kovea makal musuda. So you both say, in general, a person knows where he's going to eat his meals on Shabbos. So because he knows where he's going to eat his meals on Shabbos, therefore, halacha l'maisa, he should prepare his toothpick before Shabbos. Very simple. Prepare your toothpick before Shabbos. However, hacha adam kovea makal beis hakisei. When it comes to relieving oneself, so remember again, a person didn't always have a beis hakisei kavua. A person didn't always have an established place where he would go ahead and relieve himself. So because of that, interestingly enough, the license for moving stones on Shabbos is going to be much more permissive than the license to pick up pieces of wood for toothpicks. In other words, I will say you could prepare your toothpicks before Shabbos. You could do that. Stones, on the other hand, to relieve oneself, it's not always pashut that a person has access to a beis hakisei kavua, to an established bathroom, and therefore the license to move stones is going to be broader. Amar Rav Huna. Asrli panos b'sadanir b'Shabbos. So Rav Huna says you are not permitted to relieve yourself. Sadanir means a plowed field. So remember again, we actually spoke about this before. This is especially applicable to Eretz Yisrael. They would plow the fields twice in Eretz Yisrael. The first time was to plow, to open up the soil. Then they would go ahead and put the seeds in the soil. Then they would plow a second time. So I will say sadanir is a plowed field that has been plowed the first time. So the Gemara says you are not permitted to relieve yourself in a plowed field on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Ilema mishum davsha. If you want to say because at the end of the day, I'm ruining my friend's plowed field, right? He plowed his field. If I start relieving myself on the field, I'm ruining the quality of his field. If that's the case, I feel a b'chol nami. The Rabbi say that's not a din in Shabbos. That's true all of the time. In other words, the halacha should be you're not permitted to relieve yourself on your friend's field. Ela mishum asavim. Rather, you have to say it's because of what? It's because ultimately, again, of grass. And we'll say, now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Mishum asavim, almost right across in Rashi. Mishum asavim, shemachmas lachluchis hanir asavim olim alat surar. Because of the moisture on the field, grass often grows on the stones. On the stones. So the Gemara says, so what's the concern here? Apparently, a plowed field is also irrigated, is also watered. So because of the moisture that's in a plowed field, grass often grows on stones. If I'm relieving myself in the field, bipashtas, I'm going to wipe myself with the available stones in the field. What's the concern? The concern is that if I utilize one of those stones, I'm going to come to remove the grass from the stone. And of course, that is going to be problematic on Shabbos. Rashi says, Mishum lachluchis. Again, shemachmas nachluchis, because of the moisture of the field, asavim olmatzra, grass begins to grow on the stone. And ultimately, again, when I wipe myself with the stone, so the grass becomes detached from the stone, and this is problematic. I v'ha'amar Reish Lakish, surar sha'alu ba'asavim, mutar lekaneach bo. But Reish Lakish said that if you have a tzar, if you have a stone, and grass began to sprout on the stone, you are permitted to use that stone to wipe yourself. The Gemara says, now remember again, but if one intentionally removes the grass from it on Shabbos, you're chayiv b'chadas. Now both say, Now, according to this approach, the reason that you're permitted to go ahead and remove the grass from the stone, the reason you're permitted to go ahead and wipe yourself is because the assumption is that even if halacha lemaisa, you end up going ahead and removing some of the grass, that's what's called a davar she'eino miskaven. That's called an action for which you lack intent. And in general, we assume that the halacha is that you're going to be potter by a davar she'eino miskaven. Elo, so what's the concern about defecating in a field? Elo dilma nokit me'iloi v'shada litasoi. Rather, I will say, interestingly enough, there's a different discussion here, a different problem. We don't want you defecating in a field. Why? Because ultimately, again, you may go ahead and end up taking a stone from a higher area in the field and throwing it into a lower area in the field, ending up what? Ending up leveling out the ground in the field. We'll say if you have a pit and you went ahead and you leveled out the pit, so we'll say bebayis, if you did this inside your home, chayiv mishum bona, you are chayiv because of building. Basaden, if you did this in the field, chayiv mishum choresh. Ultimately, again, you will be chayiv because of plowing. So therefore, we'll say it turns out, interestingly enough, that the issue of defecating in a plowed field, the Gemara actually says is not an issue that you may come to ruin the field, because then that would be an issue during the week as well, and doesn't even really seem to be an issue that you may come to go ahead and remove the grass from the stone, because even if you did that, that's a davar she'eino miskaven. You're not doing that intentionally, you're doing that unintentionally. Rather, the concern seems to be one that you may come to inadvertently come to plow. How would you come to plow, Abosai? Because if you end up taking a stone from one area and throwing it into a depression in the ground, thereby leveling out the ground, you are chayiv ultimately again because of plowing. So the Gemara says as follows. Gufa, let's go back and analyze this. Rish Lakish, so Amar Rish Lakish, Tzrar she'alu bo asavim, mutar lekanech bo. So what Rish Lakish said before, that if you have a stone that grass sprouted on it on Shabbos, you are permitted to wipe yourself with that stone on Shabbos. V'atolush mimeno b'Shabbos chayiv chatos. And if one goes ahead and, however, tears the grass off, uproots the grass from that stone on Shabbos intentionally, you'll be chayiv, or unintentionally, chayiv chatos. Amra Papi says, Shma mila midrei Lakish. From Rish Lakish, you can learn the following: Hai parfisa shari letaltule. This parfisa, you are permitted to go ahead and carry it on Shabbos or move it on Shabbos. I will say, if you look at Rashi, parfisa, this is actually very interesting. He says, Otzitz nakov. This is a perforated flower pot. So I will say, just to understand something. Chazal understood that if you have a perforated pot that sits on top of the soil, that potted plant, right, because of its perforations, is still able to draw yenika, is still able to draw some level of nourishment or sustenance from the soil itself. So Rashi says over here, Otzitz nakov shezarabo ubechuvas hagaonim matzasi. And I will say, I have to tell you, there's an incredible, overwhelming Rashi here. Before we get to the Rashi, let's just finish the Gemara. Hai parfisa shel tatule maskif la Rav Kahana. So therefore, again, you're permitted to move the flower pot. I will say, why are you permitted to move the flower pot? Because even though the flower pot goes ahead and gains some level of nutrition and nourishment from the soil, it's not attached to the soil. Maskif la Rav Kahana im amru l'tzorach yom shel l'tzorach. So Rav Kahana said, I don't understand. Just because we said that you're permitted to go ahead and move stones on Shabbos because of kavod abrios, does that give us a license ultimately again to move perforated flower pots? So rather says the Gemara, Amar Abaye parfisa hoil va'asel yada lema buhu milsa. So Abaye says, now that we started talking about perforated flower pots, let's begin to discuss it a little bit more. Hayamunach al gabe karka. If halacha l'maisa, you have a perforated flower pot that was sitting on the ground, sitting on the earth, ve'nicha gabe yisedos, and you take it from the earth and now you put it on top of pegs. So what you did is it was sitting on the ground. Now you lifted it up off the ground. Mechaye mishum tolesh. You are chayiv ultimately again for talisha, for uprooting something. Hayamunach al gabe yisedos ve'nicha gabe karka chayiv mishum notea. Similarly, again, if you were to go ahead and have a perforated flower pot that was sitting on pegs, right, meaning it wasn't attached to the ground, you were to put it on the ground, you would be chayiv because of planting. So I will say, this is part of a bigger machlokas, which we'll actually discuss later on in this Masechta, about the nature of a perforated flower pot. And again, is it considered to be mechuber lekarka, attached to the ground, not attached to the ground? Obviously, that has major ramifications for Shabbos. So we'll say, but before we go ahead and go on, I have to show you an incredible Rashi. If you look at Rashi, Hai Parfisa, do you see it? It's pretty much right across now. We're up to in the Gemara. We're up to now. Rabbi Yochanan Asur Lekaneach. Rashi Hai Parfisa is right across. We'll say, watch this. So the Gemara says, Rashi says, Atzitz Nakov Shazarabo, listen to this. Ubetshuvas HaGeonim, this is incredible. In the Tshuvas HaGeonim, Rashi writes, Matzasi, Sha'osin Choslos Mikapos Tamarim. It used to be, in the olden days, they would make baskets out of palm leaves. Make baskets out of palm leaves. Umimalin Osin Afar, they would fill these baskets with dirt, vizevel, and with compost, with manure, with fertilizer. The Chav Beis Otesvav Yom Lefnei Rosh Hashanah. And 22 or 15 days before Rosh Hashanah, Osin kol echad ve'echad l'shem kol katan u'ktana shebebayis. Each parent would make one of these potted plants. So they would take literally again. So made a basket made out of palm branches, fill it with earth and with fertilizer, and 15 to 22 days, ultimately again before Rosh Hashanah, every parent would take one of these baskets corresponding to their children. So however many children you had, that was the number of baskets you would bring. And what would happen? And they would plant in it these type of legumes. Pola mitzri, kitnis, these were fast growing plants. They call them parfisa. They would call this parfisa. Vitzameach. And I will say the idea is because these are fast growing plants, they were doing this 15, 22 days before Rosh Hashanah. By the time Rosh Hashanah came along, the plant had already blossomed. The kitnis, the legume had already blossomed. Ube'erev Rosh Hashanah, notel kol echad shalo. Each and every Rosh Hashanah, each child would take his potted plant, umachaziro sevivas rosho, and he would take the potted plant, and the child would move it around his head, right, shiva pamim, 7 times, and he would say, va'omer zeh tachas zeh, zeh tachas zeh, zeh chalifasi, zeh tzimurasi, umashlicho lenar. He would wave it over his head. He would say, this is instead of me, this is my exchange, and ultimately what? Cast the plant into the river. So Rabbi say, this is incredible, because what do you see from this Tshuvas HaGeonim? What you see is that originally, the practices of kaparas and tashlich were really one practice, both done on Erev Rosh Hashanah with this potted plant. So the potted plant ultimately again was used as kaparas, and then afterwards cast into the river. Again, I don't know, I have to look into this more to see a little bit historically when these practices were split off into two. But I will say, here you have Shabbos, Tshuvas HaGeonim, about the way they used to do this combined practice on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Really, really quite amazing. So the Gemara goes right to Rabbi Yochanan. You're not permitted to wipe yourself with a pottery shard on Shabbos, an earthenware shard. My time, what's the reason? Imishum sakana. If it's an issue, ultimately again because of sakana. So I will say, maybe the concern was because a pottery shard is sharp. Maybe the concern is that a person may come to cut themselves or injure themselves, and that's why you can't use it. But if that's the case, afilu b'chol nami, we'll say then it should be usher even during the week. Ela mishum kshafim. Rather, you have to say it's because of witchcraft. I will say we'll discuss this more probably in tomorrow's daf. That apparently, again, one of the ways to cast a spell on a person, witchcraft sorcery, was to go ahead and find the pottery shard that they had used to clean themselves. But if that's the case, again, the concern there is even during the week. Ella mishum hasharas nimin. Rather, we'll say the concern was because a pottery shard is sharp, you may come to remove hairs when wiping yourself, and of course that's problematic on Shabbos. I davar shem miskavinu. We'll say even if I do that, that's davar shem miskavinu, or that's not my intention. That's not my intention. So because it's not my intention, why should it be aser? Rather, the Gemara says, Amar luhu Rav Nasan bar Ushia Gavra Rabba Amar Milsa. Since a great man said something, Nema Be Taimo. Let's try to analyze why he said it. Lomi boy b'chol the aser avad b'Shabbos hol v'ikotoras kliyalav because kliyalav shabridam. So we'll say don't say that just using a pottery shard during the week is going to be aser. Right there, we'll say we've established using a pottery shard during the week is going to be aser. Why? Because at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, again, either because it removes hairs or because of witchcraft. So don't say that it's just us on Shabbos. Excuse me, during the week. But on Shabbos you could use it because at the end of the day it's not really muktzah. And I would say maybe even a pottery shard is better than a stone. Why? Because whereas a stone is muktzah, a pottery shard could still have the status of a kli if it's large enough. Kamash Mulan, you still can't use it on Shabbos. Rava, masni la mishuma sharas nimin. Rava said the reason you can't use a pottery shard on Shabbos is why? Because you may come to remove hairs. The kashle Rabbi Yochanan, but the problem is about saying now we have a machlok. It's Rabbi Yochanan, right? The Gemara says Miyamar Rabbi Yochanan asla kaneach becharis b'Shabbos. Because remember again, did Rabbi Yochanan say that you can't use an earthenware utensil, right, an earthenware shard to wipe yourself on Shabbos? Why? Because the assumption is that it's going to remove hairs. But one second, Alma davar shein miskavin aser. That was it was saying. Now remember, even if it does remove hairs, that's certainly not my intention. That's a davar shein miskavein. But if it's a davar shein miskavein, then ultimately what? It should be mutter. To which the Gemara says, and you're telling me now that a davar shein miskavein is aser. Vam Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam mishnah. Yet Rabbi Yochanan said that halacha follows a stam mishnah. What does the stam mishnah say? The Gemara says utnan nazir chofeif umefasfeis avalo sorik. A navi could rub his head and can even detangle his hair with his fingers. He just can't do so with a comb. Now, both say even when he rubs his head or he detangles his hair with his fingers, it's possible he's going to pull out a hair. But lamaisa, it's not usher, because again, even if he does so, it's not intentional. So you see that Rabbi Yochanan holds that a davar shein miskavein is mutter. So which one is it? Ella mechavarta kirav nasan bar Ushia. Rather, the Gemara says you're right. Rather, let's go back, and it would appear that halacha lamaisa, it's like Rav Nasan bar Oshia said, which is what? That halacha lamaisa, the real concern regarding the use of the pottery shard on Shabbos, ultimately again is not for the possible removal of hairs. Because remember, even if that happens, that's a davar shein miskavein, an unintentional act, and one is not chayav for davar shein miskavein. So what's the problem with using the pottery shard ultimately on Shabbos? Could be a potential issue of witchcraft, of kishuf. So we'll say we will stop over here for today, and Amirat Hashem, we will begin tomorrow with the words Mike Shafim, ultimately understanding the role or the nature of the kishuf, of the witchcraft involved in the pottery shard. I will say, Yeshakayach, beautiful daf. We'll Amirat Hashem continue from here tomorrow. Shkach, I will say, everyone have a wonderful day.